He bruises easily, nurse. He's always been a clumsy boy. That's what my mother said, standing in the middle of a fluorescent-lit emergency room at 7:09 on a Tuesday night, smiling at the intake nurse like she was returning a library book. Calm, practiced, like she'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. The doctor had already photographed the handprint on my son's arm. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood next to Declan's bed with my hand on his shoulder and watched my mother try to erase what had been done to him. And something inside me shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just a clean, quiet break. My name is Shelby Miller. I'm 31 years old. I'm a registered dental hygienist. I'm a divorced mother of one. And for 6 years, I paid for the privilege of watching my family destroy itself from the inside out until the night they put their hands on my son. If you've ever had a family member treat you like you didn't matter, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me take you back. I got divorced when Declan was 4. His father moved out of state. No visitation, no phone calls, no birthday cards. That was the deal, and honestly, it was the cleanest thing I ever got out of that marriage. Declan and I were on our own, and I was fine with that. I picked up work at a dental clinic just outside Milwaukee. Hygienist position, steady hours, good benefits. Within a year, I was pulling double shifts 3 days a week. My annual income hit $78,000, which for a single mother with a 4-year-old felt like breathing for the first time. But here's the thing about breathing. Once your family knows you can do it, they start expecting you to breathe for them too. Troy is my younger brother, 5 years younger, 26 now. When I was finishing my clinical hours and studying for boards, Troy was playing video games in my parents' basement. When I was signing my first lease and stocking a kitchen for 2, Troy was dropping out of his second semester of community college because the commute was, and I'm quoting him here, killing his energy. My parents never blinked. Troy was the baby. Troy was sensitive. Troy had potential if only the right opportunity came along. That was the phrase my mother used like a prayer. If only the right opportunity came along for Troy. The right opportunity, as it turned out, was me. 6 years ago, Troy announced he was starting a custom PC building business. He had no business plan, no clients, no experience beyond assembling his own gaming rigs in the basement. But he had a workspace he wanted to lease. And a lease requires money, and money requires a job. And Troy didn't have one of those. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. I remember because Declan was in the bath and I was holding the phone between my shoulder and my ear while rinsing shampoo out of his hair. Your brother just needs a little help getting started. You know how it is, Shelby. Not everyone lands on their feet the way you did. I paid the lease on Troy's workspace. $18,000 over the life of that venture. $18,000 for a business that never turned a single dollar of profit, never built a single PC for a paying customer, and quietly folded after 11 months when Troy decided the market was oversaturated. He kept the equipment. But that was only the beginning. 2 years into my clinic work, I got a call from my father. Not my mother, my father. Richard Miller almost never calls anyone. He's the kind of man who sits at the head of the table with his hands folded and his eyes fixed on his plate. He doesn't speak up. He doesn't intervene. He clears his throat sometimes, but nobody turns to look. So when Dad called, I knew it was serious. The property taxes on my parents' house were 14 months overdue. The county had filed a lien. They were facing foreclosure. I didn't ask how it happened. I didn't ask where the money went. I drove to the county office the next morning and paid $12,000 directly to clear the immediate arrears. I set up a payment plan for the remaining $45,000 balance, and I co-signed it. My name, my credit, my signature on the dotted line guaranteeing that if my parents missed a single payment, the county would come after me. My mother thanked me by saying, "Well, that's what family does." My father said nothing. He stared at the floor. He nodded once. And then there was the weekly money. When Declan started first grade, I needed consistent after-school care 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. My shifts ran late, and daycare pickup was at 5:30. My parents offered to watch him. My mother framed it as a gift. We'd love to spend time with our grandson, Shelby. Don't even think about it. I thought about it anyway because nothing in my family comes without a ledger. So I offered to contribute. $175 a week. Household money, I called it. Groceries, utilities, whatever they needed to keep things running while Declan was there. $175 a week, every week, for 72 weeks straight. That's $12,600. I found out later, not from my parents, but from a bank statement I pulled when things started unraveling, that the money wasn't going toward groceries or utilities. It was going toward Troy's high-speed fiber internet package, his cloud gaming subscriptions, his online tournament entry fees. The $175 I sent every week to feed my son was feeding my brother's screen addiction. When I add it all up, the number is $42,600. Over 6 years. That's what I gave. $18,000 for a business that never existed. $12,000 to save a house I didn't live in. $12,600 in weekly payments rerouted to my brother's entertainment. And for 6 years I told myself this was simply what family did. I told myself it was fair. I made good money. They were watching my son. Troy was supposedly bonding with his nephew. My parents had a purpose. Everyone was taken care of. I brushed off the small things. The way my mother introduced Troy to neighbors as our entrepreneur, while calling me Shelby, the one who cleans teeth. The way my father never once asked about my work, but could recite Troy's latest gaming statistics. The way Troy himself would walk past me at family dinners without making eye contact, then text me 3 hours later asking if I could Venmo him $60 for a component he needed. I pushed it down. 14 months before the night everything changed, Troy started a new campaign. He wanted an upgraded gaming rig, not a small upgrade, a full custom build, liquid cooling, dual monitors, mechanical keyboard. The total he quoted me, casually, over a plate of my mother's meatloaf, was $4,000. I said no. Troy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. My father stared at his plate. I said no, Troy. I can't keep funding equipment. Troy leaned back in his chair. I watch your kid twice a week, Shelby. For free. You know how much daycare costs? You should be thanking me. My mother nodded. He has a point. I stayed quiet. There was nothing to add. Troy got his rig anyway. I don't know who paid for it. I suspect my mother redirected some of the weekly household money I was still sending, but the rig appeared in the basement. $4,000 of glowing lights and humming fans, sitting 3 feet from the couch where my 8-year-old son spent his Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Troy made the rules clear to Declan early. Don't touch the desk. Don't touch the monitors. Don't touch the keyboard. Don't even breathe near the tower. Declan is 8. He's quiet. He's perceptive. He's tall for his age. And he listens. He always listens. But he's 8. Tuesday, October 12th. 80 degrees outside. Indian summer in Wisconsin. The kind of day where kids wear shorts and tank tops and come home smelling like grass and sweat. I pulled into my parents' driveway at 6:14 p.m. I was 12 minutes late because a patient's cleaning had run over, and I'd stayed to finish the charting. Declan was sitting on the front porch, alone, long-sleeved shirt, in 80-degree weather. I noticed it before I even turned off the engine. The sleeves were pulled down to his wrists, and he was holding the cuffs in his fists. His eyes were red but dry. He'd been crying, but he'd stopped. He'd made himself stop. I got out of the car. I walked up the steps. I knelt in front of him. Hey, buddy, why the long sleeves? He didn't answer. His eyes dropped to his lap. Declan? His voice was small, cracked right down the middle. Uncle Troy said I shouldn't show you. I stayed calm. I kept my voice steady. Can I see? He didn't move. I reached slowly and lifted the sleeve of his left arm, pushing the fabric up past his elbow. 5 bruises? Not scattered, not random. 5 distinct oval marks wrapped around his upper arm in the exact pattern of an adult male hand. A 5-finger hematoma, the doctor would later call it. The thumb mark was on the inside of his bicep. The 4 finger marks curved around the outside. The skin was already darkening from red to purple. I looked at the handprint on my son's arm, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, nothing. Just clarity. What happened? Declan's hand found my sleeve. His fingers twisted the fabric until it went white under his knuckles. I was walking past Uncle Troy's desk and my elbow bumped one of the monitors. It didn't even fall, it just wobbled, and he grabbed me, really hard, And he said if I ever touched his stuff again, I'd learn what a real consequence felt like. I didn't respond. I just listened. Grandma saw. She came downstairs, and she told me to put on a long-sleeve shirt and stop being dramatic. I stayed there on my knees for a long time. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and stopped. I could hear the television through the front door. Troy was still inside. My mother was still inside. I didn't go inside. I stood up. I took Declan's hand. I walked him to the car. I buckled his seatbelt. I got in the driver's seat. And I drove straight to the emergency room without calling anyone. The intake nurse at St. Francis documented everything at 6:47 p.m. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Wilson, photographed the bruise from 4 angles under clinical lighting. She measured the spread of the finger marks. She noted the depth of discoloration. She asked Declan, gently and separately from me, what happened. He told her the same thing he told me, word for word. An 8-year-old doesn't rehearse a lie. He tells you what happened because he doesn't know yet that the truth is supposed to be inconvenient. Dr. Wilson looked at me across the exam room. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't need to. She said, I'm filing a mandatory report. This is consistent with a forceful grab by an adult. We'll have the photographs entered into the medical record tonight. I nodded. Is there anything else you need from me right now? She asked. No, I said. You're doing exactly what needs to happen. At 7:04 p.m., my mother arrived. I hadn't called her. I hadn't called anyone. But someone at the house must have noticed my car wasn't out front and Declan wasn't on the porch because Patricia Miller walked through the emergency room doors at 7:04 p.m. with her purse over her shoulder and a look on her face that I'd seen 1,000 times before. The look that said she was about to fix this. She went straight to the intake desk. Not to me. Not to Declan. To the desk. He bruises easily, nurse. He's always been a clumsy boy. The nurse looked up at her, then looked at me, then looked back at her chart. Ma'am, the physician has already completed the examination. My mother's smile didn't waver. He's a boy, Shelby. He needs to learn to respect things that aren't his. A little bruise is a cheap lesson. I kept my voice even. Steady. Low enough that the words didn't carry past the 3 of us. I'm not here to talk about lessons, Mom. I'm here to let the doctor do her job. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it, then turned on her heel and walked back to the waiting area, where Troy had just appeared through the sliding doors. I watched through the gap in the curtain. I watched my mother lean close to my brother in those hard plastic chairs under the buzzing fluorescent lights. I watched her whisper. I watched Troy nod. I watched him rehearse something under his breath while my mother squeezed his forearm and looked toward the intake desk. They were getting their story straight. At 7:09 p.m., in a hospital waiting room, with my son's bruised arm photographed and filed 3 rooms away, my mother was coaching my brother on what to say. And what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the ER's intake security camera was mounted 6 feet above the waiting area. It captured everything. The whispering, the nodding, the rehearsal. All of it time-stamped and stored on the hospital's servers. I sat next to Declan's bed. He was holding a juice box the nurse had given him. His sleeve was still pushed up. The handprint looked worse under the hospital lights. Mom? His voice was small. Yeah, buddy. Do they really not like me? I didn't answer right away. I put my hand over his, the one without the bruise, and I held it. You didn't do anything wrong, Declan. Not one single thing. He nodded slowly. Then he went quiet. I stayed in that chair. The hospital hummed around us. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and stopped. The clock on the wall read 8:45 p.m. My mother was still in the waiting room. Troy was still in the waiting room. And that was the moment something inside me snapped. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a clean, quiet break, like a wire that had been holding too much weight for too many years, finally letting go. Not with a snap you could hear, but with a stillness you could feel. I looked at the handprint on my son's arm. I looked at the juice box in his hand. I looked at the curtain separating us from the waiting room where my mother was teaching my brother how to lie. And I was done pretending this was okay. The hospital discharged Declan at 9:38 p.m. with a printed summary of the examination, 4 clinical photographs attached to his medical record, and a case number from the mandatory CPS report. Dr. Wilson handed me a manila envelope with copies of everything. She didn't tell me to keep it safe. She didn't need to. I buckled Declan into the back seat. He fell asleep before I made it out of the parking lot. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. Just the low hum of the engine and the sound of my son breathing. I pulled into our driveway at 10:11 p.m. I carried Declan inside. I put him to bed without waking him. I pulled the long-sleeved shirt off gently and replaced it with his soft pajama top, the one with the planets on it. The bruise was there in the dim light of his bedroom, 5 dark ovals on pale skin. I pulled the blanket over his arm and stood in his doorway for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table with the manila envelope from the hospital, a cup of coffee I didn't drink, and my phone. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming. The streetlight cut through the blinds and made lines on the wall. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "We need to talk about tonight. Troy is very upset. You made a scene taking him to the hospital for nothing." I read it once. I set the phone face down on the table. I opened the manila envelope. I spread the photographs out. I looked at the handprint on my son's arm under my own kitchen light. I looked at the CPS case number printed on the intake form. I looked at the doctor's clinical notes describing the injury as consistent with a forceful grab by an adult male hand. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt clarity. Like the first morning after a fever breaks and the world comes back into focus. I picked up my phone and opened the browser. I searched for family law attorneys in the Milwaukee area who handled emergency custody and protective orders. I needed someone who could move fast and didn't flinch at filing against family. Arthur Campbell's name came up 3 times in the first 5 results. Reviews described him as sharp, clinical, no nonsense. One review said, "He doesn't hold your hand. He holds the line." I saved his number. At 7:02 the next morning, Wednesday, October 13th, I called his office before my shift. His assistant answered. I gave her the short version. My brother assaulted my 8-year-old son. I have hospital photographs, a CPS report, and security footage of my mother coaching my brother in the ER waiting room. I need a restraining order covering 3 people, and I need it fast. Arthur Campbell called me back at 11:47 a.m. during my lunch break. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot with the engine off and the windows cracked. "Ms. Miller, I reviewed the intake documents you emailed this morning. The photographs are clear. The CPS filing is already in the system, and you mentioned hospital security footage. The ER intake camera, it's mounted above the waiting area. It captured my mother coaching my brother." He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "That footage is the linchpin. Coaching a suspect in front of a security camera while a mandatory report is being filed is obstruction. It changes this from a family dispute to a criminal matter with documented co-conspirators." I didn't respond. I just listened. "Here's what I recommend. We file for an emergency temporary restraining order covering Troy Miller, Patricia Miller, and Richard Miller. We request a permanent no-contact order at the hearing, and we do it before anyone on their side has time to coordinate a narrative." "How long?" "If the judge sees these photographs and that footage, I can have a temporary order signed by end of week. Permanent hearing within 30 days. Do it. There's one more thing, Ms. Miller. You mentioned you co-signed a tax payment plan on your parents' property, and that you've been making direct financial contributions to their household. Yes. I'd recommend removing yourself from every financial obligation connected to them. Immediately. Not as punishment. As protection. If they're investigated for obstruction and your name is on their tax lien, your finances become part of their legal discovery. You need to be clean." I sat in the parking lot. The afternoon sun was coming through the windshield. Somewhere inside the clinic, my next patient was already in the chair. "I understand," I said. "I'll have the paperwork ready by Friday." Friday, October 22nd, 10 days after the handprint, 10 days of silence. I didn't call my parents. I didn't answer their calls. My phone buzzed 14 times that first week. Texts from my mother ranging from "call me back" to "you're blowing this out of proportion" to "Troy feels terrible, you know." I read none of them past the first line. I let every call go to voicemail. I deleted each one without listening. On Friday morning, I dropped Declan at school. I kissed him on the forehead. I told him I'd pick him up at 3:15 and we'd get pizza. He smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him in 10 days. I drove to Arthur Campbell's office. It was in a brick building off Wisconsin Avenue, second floor, no elevator. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a water cooler, no magazines, no music, just a clock on the wall. Arthur had everything laid out on his desk, 3 sets of documents, each one flagged with colored tabs where I needed to sign. The first was the emergency restraining order application. 3 names: Troy Miller, Patricia Miller, Richard Miller. No contact with Declan Miller or Shelby Miller by any means, including phone, text, email, social media, or third-party communication. I signed it. The second was the revocation of co-signer status on the property tax payment plan filed with the county. My name removed, my credit untethered, my guarantee withdrawn. The remaining $45,000 balance on the lien was now solely the responsibility of Richard and Patricia Miller. I signed it. The third was the termination of the automatic weekly transfer, the $175 per week I'd been sending to my parents' household account for 72 weeks. The money that was supposed to feed my son, but was feeding my brother's fiber, internet, and gaming subscriptions. I tapped open my banking app right there in Arthur's office. I scrolled to recurring transfers. I found the one labeled Family Weekly, $175, every Thursday, active for 72 consecutive weeks. I tapped Edit. I tapped Cancel. The confirmation prompt appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer? I pressed Yes. The screen updated. Status: inactive. The soft, unmistakable click of confirmation echoed in the dead silence of the room. Arthur watched me without expression. Then he gathered the signed documents into a file. The restraining order goes to the judge this afternoon. The tax revocation will be processed by the county within 5 business days. And Ms. Miller, one more thing. Yes. The ER footage has already been subpoenaed by the district attorney's office as part of Troy's assault case. Your mother's actions on that tape are now evidence in a criminal proceeding. She and your father may face obstruction charges. I want you to be prepared for that. I nodded once. I'm prepared. I walked out of Arthur Campbell's office at 11:15 a.m. The October air was cool and sharp. I got in my car. I sat for a moment. Then I drove to pick up my son's pizza order. The first call came 4 days later, Tuesday, October 26th. My mother. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. I deleted it without listening. The second call came 20 minutes after the first. My mother again. Then my father, which told me things were serious because Richard Miller does not make phone calls. Then my mother again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I later learned was Troy calling from a neighbor's phone. I turned off the ringer. The next morning, my phone showed 11 missed calls and 37 text messages. I didn't open a single one. On Thursday, October 28th, the grocery store declined my mother's card. The family card. The one linked to the household account I'd been funding. The one Troy used for energy drinks and frozen pizzas and whatever else he needed to sustain his lifestyle in my parents' basement. My mother called at 4:17 p.m. I answered. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew she'd come to the house if I didn't, and I didn't want her anywhere near Declan. Shelby Ann Miller, what did you do? The card was declined at the register in front of people. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? I kept my voice even, low, 7 words. The card has been permanently deactivated, Mom. You can't just... Troy needs to eat, Shelby. Your father needs his prescriptions. You can't just pull the rug out because you're upset about a little bruise. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not pity. Nothing. I didn't just cancel the card, Mom. I canceled the future you thought I owed you. Silence. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. The payment stopped at midnight. The tax lien is your responsibility now. I hope Troy's gaming rig was worth the house. She started to speak. Her voice cracked on the first syllable. I pressed end. Then I blocked her number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Troy's number. I went through my contacts methodically, calmly, the way I chart a patient's mouth at work. section by section. I removed myself from the family group text. I deleted the shared photo album. I removed Patricia Miller from Declan's emergency contact list at his school. I did all of it sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. It took 9 minutes. On Friday, October 29th at 6:22 p.m., a process server knocked on Troy Miller's door at my parents' house. The lights inside were already off, not because it was late, because the electricity, which was billed under a joint account I'd been subsidizing, had been disconnected 3 days earlier when the autopay bounced. Troy opened the door in the dark. The process server handed him the 4th-degree child abuse charge papers and the emergency restraining order. Troy stood in the doorway of my parents' house, in the dark, holding the documents he couldn't read without turning on a light he couldn't afford. My mother appeared behind him. I know this because Arthur Campbell told me later. She reportedly grabbed the papers from Troy's hands, read the first page, and sat down on the hallway floor. My father stood at the end of the hall. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He stared at the floor. The process server noted the time of service, 6:22 p.m. He returned to his car. The door closed behind him, not with a slam, just the quiet click of the latch sliding into place. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. That night, I sat on Declan's bedroom floor while he slept. The streetlight came through his curtain and cut a line across the wall. His arm was resting on top of the blanket. The bruise was fading, yellow at the edges now. The handprint was still there, but lighter, disappearing. I put my hand over it, gently, without touching. My hand was almost the same size. I pulled the blanket up over his arm. I walked to my bedroom. I closed the door. I turned off the ringer on my phone. I set it face down on the nightstand. The house was dark except for the streetlight. The house was quiet except for my son breathing down the hall. The door was closed. The cut was clean. The weeks following October turned cold the way Wisconsin knows how, fast and without apology. The trees dropped everything they had, and the streets went bare overnight. Declan and I settled into something I didn't recognize at first because I'd never felt it before. Quiet that wasn't hiding anything. I picked him up from school every day at 3:15. I found an after-school program at the community center 3 blocks from the clinic, $12 a day. Declan liked it. They had a reading corner and a kid named Marcus who collected rocks and wanted to show every single one to anyone who would sit still long enough. Declan sat still. He always sits still. I stopped checking my phone for missed calls. There weren't any. The numbers were blocked. The voicemails had stopped. The group text no longer existed. My mother's name didn't appear on my screen anymore, and after the first 2 weeks, I stopped reaching for the phone, expecting it to. I slept through the night for the first time in years. No buzzing. No guilt vibrating through the mattress at 11 p.m. because Troy needed a Venmo, or my mother needed reassurance that I wasn't abandoning them. Just darkness and silence and the sound of the furnace kicking on at 2 a.m. because the temperature had dropped again. November passed. December passed. The holidays came and went, and Declan and I spent Christmas morning on the living room floor with pancakes and a Lego set that took us 4 hours to build. He didn't ask about his grandparents. He didn't ask about Troy. He talked about Marcus and the rocks and whether Neptune had storms that could fit the whole earth inside them. I let him talk. I listened to every word. The information came to me in pieces over the following months. Not because I asked. I didn't. Arthur Campbell's office handled the legal proceedings, and updates arrived in crisp envelopes with itemized timelines. Occasionally, a coworker at the clinic who lived on the same side of town as my parents would mention something in passing, the way people do when they don't realize they're delivering a verdict. Troy's assault case went to court in January. He pled no contest to 4th-degree child abuse. The judge reviewed the ER photographs, Dr. Wilson's clinical notes, and Declan's recorded statement. Troy received a suspended sentence of 18 months, 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management, and a permanent restriction barring him from unsupervised contact with any minor. Any minor, not just Declan, any child. That restriction followed him everywhere. Background checks for employment returned the conviction. Applications for retail work, warehouse positions, food service, anything that might place him near families or children came back denied. Troy Miller, 26 years old, with no degree, no work history, and a child abuse conviction on his record, became functionally unemployable in the Milwaukee metro area within 90 days of sentencing. Arthur told me Troy had applied to 11 positions by March. All 11 rejected him. My mother's situation unraveled on a different timeline, but with the same inevitability. The obstruction investigation moved slowly. The ER security footage was entered into evidence in December. The tape showed what the tape showed. Patricia Miller leaning close to Troy in the waiting room, whispering, Troy nodding, Troy mouthing phrases back to her, my mother glancing toward the intake desk and then squeezing his arm. Time-stamped. Recorded. Undeniable. Patricia was charged with obstruction of justice in February. A misdemeanor, but enough. She received 12 months of probation and a $2,200 fine. The court noted her attempt to interfere with a mandatory child abuse report as an aggravating factor. My father was not charged. Richard Miller's silence for once worked in his legal favor. There was no evidence he coached anyone, said anything to the staff, or participated in any attempt to alter the narrative. He was present. He did nothing. The court found that unremarkable. I found it unsurprising. But the financial collapse didn't come from the courtroom. It came from the kitchen table where my parents sat every month trying to figure out how to survive without $1,200 they'd never earned. The first payment on the tax lien came due in November. Without my co-signature, without my automatic transfers, and without the weekly $175 that had been propping up their household for 3 years, my parents missed it. They missed December's too. By January, the county had issued a default notice. The $45,000 lien accelerated. The full balance became due. My parents didn't have it. They'd never had it. I'd been the only reason they'd been making payments at all. And now the math was exposed in a way that couldn't be argued with or coached away. The house entered foreclosure proceedings in March. My parents listed it for sale in April, hoping to get ahead of the auction. The realtor priced it at $142,000. It sold for $118,500, which, after the lien, closing costs, and the realtor's commission, left Patricia and Richard Miller with just under $11,000 in cash. 41 years in that house. Troy's gaming setup in the basement. The porch where Declan sat in his long sleeves on an 80-degree afternoon. The hallway where my mother sat on the floor reading the restraining order. All of it sold to strangers for less than they owed. They moved into a rental on the south side, a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat. 1 bedroom, shared parking. My mother, who had once introduced Troy to the neighbors as our entrepreneur, now lived in a building where the elevator didn't work and the hallway smelled like detergent and cooking oil. Troy moved in with them. There was nowhere else for him to go. 26 years old, convicted, barred from contact with children, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with his parents. He reportedly sold the gaming rig in May, the $4,000 setup, the one Declan wasn't allowed to touch, the one that started all of this, went on a local marketplace listing for $1,100. Someone picked it up in a hatchback. I heard through a coworker that my father started driving for a rideshare service on weekends. Richard Miller, 61 years old, who never made phone calls and never spoke at the dinner table, was now driving strangers around Milwaukee on Saturday nights to cover rent. My mother tried once. 1 letter. It arrived at my house in June, handwritten on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope before I opened the mailbox all the way. I held the envelope. I looked at it for a few seconds. Then I set it on the kitchen counter. I never opened it. 3 days later, I put it in the recycling bin with the grocery circulars. I didn't do it in anger. I did it in clarity. A year passed. October again. Wisconsin doing what Wisconsin does. The leaves dropping, the air sharpening. Declan turned 9 in September. He had a party at the community center with Marcus and 4 other boys from his after-school program. They ate pizza and built a volcano out of baking soda and vinegar in the parking lot. Declan laughed until he couldn't breathe. I watched from the bench. I held a paper plate with a slice of cake I hadn't touched, and I thought about what this day would have looked like a year ago. My mother hovering, making it about Troy. Troy not showing up. My father sitting in a corner saying nothing. Declan wearing long sleeves. Now there were 9-year-olds covered in vinegar screaming about lava. Declan made the honor roll in October. His teacher sent a note home that said he was one of the most thoughtful readers in the class. He joined a science club that met on Wednesdays. He came home with facts about tectonic plates and cloud formations and the specific gravity of different types of sandstone because Marcus was still collecting rocks and Declan had decided to help him classify them. He slept through the night. Every night. No bad dreams. No flinching when someone moved too fast near his arm. The bruise was gone. The handprint had faded months ago, absorbed back into skin that was growing and stretching and turning brown from summer sun and then pale again from autumn cold. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after the night in the ER, Declan and I were sitting on the back steps of our house. It was a small house. 2 bedrooms, a fenced yard. His room was painted dark blue because he'd asked for it, and I'd said yes, and we'd done it together on a Saturday with rollers and drop cloths and too much painter's tape. He was holding a piece of quartz Marcus had given him, turning it over in his hands. The porch light caught the edge of it and threw a small flash across the fence. "Mom?" "Yeah, buddy." "I'm glad it's just us." I looked at him. His arm was bare, short sleeves. October evening, but he ran warm. "Me too." He turned the quartz over one more time. "I have you. That's enough family for me." I put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned into me. The porch light hummed. Somewhere down the block, that same dog barked twice and stopped. I didn't look back. Some doors close, so better ones can open. I never regretted a single second of the silence that followed. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's protection. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Loyalty earns its place. The cut was clean. If you enjoyed this story about protecting your children and knowing your worth, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.